Welcome to the System Administration session. So I'm excited to be able to present this session to you, hopefully make your job as a system administrator or developer, somebody who implements and maybe installs software at the customer site. Hopefully the things you'll be learning today will make your job more enjoyable and easier. So let's take a look at what we're going to be covering. First off, we're going to be talking about the Basis License Service, or BLS. This is an exciting new feature that Basis has been developing for several months now, and I think you're going to be really thrilled to see this improvement when it comes to licensing. You're going to be looking at some new and improved features in the Enterprise Manager. We're going to be talking about token-based authentication that can be used in the Admin API. We're going to be looking at how you can set up the Enterprise Manager, specifically the browser-based Enterprise Manager, to use SAML authentication instead of the typical username and password. And then finally, we're going to be wrapping it up by talking about a really cool plugin that allows you to incorporate single sign-on and multi-factor authentication right inside your BBJ applications. So BBJ includes the Enterprise Manager as well as a full-featured Admin API to provide administrators and developers with GUI and programmatic access to all of the administrative functions necessary to configure and manage your BBJ services. So one of the exciting things with the Admin API that I wanted to highlight before we go any further is that the Admin API provides all of the functionality that you see in the Enterprise Manager. So if you see functionality in the Enterprise Manager and think that you'd like to build that into your application or do that in some way for some reason programmatically, you can be assured that you can do that using the Admin API. So we're not going to go into details with the Admin API, but I wanted to highlight that important point because a lot of people don't realize that. All right, so let's talk first about the Basis License Service, or BLS. So first off, what is it? Well, it's a replacement for FlexLM. And beginning in version 22, the BLS completely replaces the BLM. It's a complete replacement, complete rewrite, and it was developed from the ground up by Basis. So the great thing with that is that this provides all of the same functionality as well as features such as enhanced security, and Basis has complete control over all of this. So we can build on and add additional features as time goes on. Most notable change for the user in when looking at the BLS versus the FlexLM BLM is that the user is, or the client, that would be BBjServices. BBjServices being the client that's connecting to the Basis License Service. In this case, it's going to be using a certificate.bls file for authenticating with the license server. This means that you can't simply point any old BBjServices at a license server. It has to have this appropriate certificate file available in order to make that connection. And so this is a significant improvement over FlexLM. All right, so what are some of the benefits of using the BLS? Why did we bother putting all the effort into developing this? Well, there's no more reliance on a third party, and I think that's a huge win right there in and of itself. FlexLM is a black box, so if something needed changed, fixed, enhanced, we were out of luck unless FlexLM decided that they were going to make those changes for us. And so now we're able to react much more quickly when any changes or fixes or enhancements need to be made to better serve the needs of our customer base. Also, there's more customization capabilities, no one-size-fits-all approach any longer. Also, you'll find that it's more efficient when it comes to the utilization of operating system resources, and so this is nice as well. You'll find that fewer socket ports are needed, as well as fewer processes. And the BLS is entirely Java-based, so more platforms can be supported now, as well as in the future, should the need arise. And it's also much more secure. So as I pointed out a minute ago when I talked about the certificate.bls file, all clients must have that certificate available in order to establish a connection with the license server. And as you can imagine, that's a big benefit there, because now you can't have any rogue BBjServices installations pointed to your license server unless they happen to have your certificate. So only those who you intentionally give out that certificate to will have the ability to connect to the license server. To better illustrate why all users of Basis technologies will benefit from the new BLS, let's take a look at March of 2020, where Basis sent out a technical communique. And in this communique, we were informing developers and users of Basis technologies that we had released new version 20 of the Basis License Manager. And this new version happened to address vulnerabilities that had come to light with the FlexNet publisher, formerly known as FlexLM licensing system, which is what we use inside of the Basis License Manager. Now, the FlexNet publisher did address these issues, which was great. And so in order to take advantage of those, we needed to also respond very quickly and address those inside a new version of the BLM. All right, and since we're on the subject, we might as well head over to basis.com and kind of complete this particular topic. So at basis.com, we can get access to that technical communique that I was just talking about in case you don't have it handy in your email box. So at basis.com, just come over to About Us, click on that. On the About Us page, you'll have the announcements and you can click on communiques. And from this page, it's very easy. Just do a quick little page search, BLM. And that takes you right down to the spot on the page that references Basis releases more secure BLM. And as you can see, that was done on March 13th of 2020. So we'll click on that. And here's our technical communique that addresses it. So I'm going to just point out a couple of key things to be aware of here. So first and foremost, there is a link to the FlexNet publisher site that addresses the details of this particular vulnerability in case you're interested. So you can go read more about that there. We won't go into any more of those details here, but that's easily accessible from this particular page. You'll also notice that we've released a version 20 of the Basis License Manager. And if you scroll down a little bit more, you'll find out the good news, which is that there is no need to upgrade your Basis interpreter. That includes BBJ, Pro 5, or Visual Pro 5. All of those interpreters will continue to run if you just install the new version of the Basis License Manager. Also, scroll down a little bit farther, and you'll find out that you do need a version 20 license in order for the version 20 BLM to operate. No need to worry there either, because you can get a new license if you have an older one, as long as you're current on your SAM renewals. And then you'll notice finally here that we do point out how you can look at your current license and find out, is it a version 20 or do I need to go about upgrading it before installing the new BLM? So all the information that you need to know about is right here on this technical communique. And of course, if you have any other questions or need assistance in that area, just contact your sales representative or Basis technical support for additional help in that area. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the BLS and monitoring. So when it comes to monitoring, there are a couple of different options available. So you may be familiar with the FlexLM command line tools, and we do provide some command line tools to interact with the BLS as well. So we have the BLS monitor command line tool, and this is essentially a replacement for LMUtil, LMtools, that kind of thing. It also provides some licensing metrics. You'll also find the BLS status, and again, that is going to help if you need to just do a quick check on the status of your licensed server. You can do that from the command line or incorporate that into a script if necessary. It also does provide some Prometheus metrics as well, and so this can be very beneficial to observe behavior of your system and license usage over time at various points in time. You can see the way that licenses are being used, how many are available at any given point in time, that kind of thing. So that can be a very beneficial tool as well. And however, most licensing monitoring should really be done through the Enterprise Manager, which we'll be looking at here momentarily. It's a nice user interface, provides some nice ways of filtering through that information, and it should probably become the kind of the go-to when monitoring your license usage. All right, so let's talk about a couple of notes here before we get into that demo. So the BLS, it's important to understand that you cannot run it and a BLM on the same server. They use the same ports. That is by design. Also, there's no interoperability with older BBJ clients. So once you move on to the BLS, older BBJ clients can't connect to that. It's not a backward compatible network protocol with FlexLM. Newer BBJ, Pro 5, and Visual Pro 5 clients will all need to use the BLS rather than the BLM. So keep that in mind as you move forward. Also, keep in mind, again, that this will be compatible with BBJ 2120 and newer, and that's what the plan is currently. All right, so let's talk a little bit about monitoring the Basis License Service. So most monitoring tasks, as I pointed out, can be easily done using the Enterprise Manager, and that's probably where you'll typically do most of this. So you'll be able to view details about license usage as well as availability, and this is a really nice feature here. So you can see things like your serial number, the features that are included in your license, the number of licenses that are in use and available, but also with the BLS, you can also see things like who's using the license and their machine information and whether it's connection-based or not. So those are some nice improvements that you'll see moving forward using the BLS over FlexLM. So let's take a look at a demo. All right, so let's take a look now at the Enterprise Manager and the powerful user interface that it provides for you to help manage and monitor your license usage. So underneath BBjServices, we have a licensing item, and we can open that up and view initially some summary information about how our license is being used. So we have our serial number here, and then we have a list of the items that are currently available for our license. So in addition to the items, we have a breakdown of the number of licenses available for each one of those items under the count column. And then we also have the number that are currently in use of each one of those items. So you have some nice separation there of how each one of the licenses is being used. Now, if you'd like to get some additional detail or information, maybe who's using those licenses, what machines those licenses are coming from, then you can select one of these items and drill down even further. So we select the BBJ one, and we want to figure out, hey, what is using these 7 licenses? Who is using these 7 licenses? Now, as you see here, it opens up a list of connection sources, and these connection sources represent a BBjServices installation that's currently using this BLS. And so if there were multiple installations using the same BLS, you would see more than one of those appear down below here. Also, if you're using Pro 5, each Pro 5 connection that is using a license will show up with a different connection here. So keep that in mind if you're continuing to use Pro 5 with the BLS. Now, we can expand this out. Again, you see how many are in use for that particular connection, but then you can open it up and drill down and further see how those licenses are being used. So here we see we have JAsh and Java J. JAsh is currently using 1 license here. Java J has 2. JDO has 1. And we also see the IP address that's available as well that is using that particular license checkout. We can also see here whether it was a connection-based license. So in this case here, these are 2 JDBC connections. ODBC connections would also look very similar. And so those are connection-based. So we can see at a glance whether it's a connection-based license, a non-connection-based license, who has that license in use and what machine they're coming from. We also have the ability to filter the information. So if you have a very large system, you can further search on the user. So we can look for just a particular user, apply that to the list, and then you see it filters out everything we're not interested in. We can also look for IP address or whether we are just interested in connection-based licenses, for example. Now, one last thing that I'd like to show you is the export feature. So the export button up here allows you to export the contents of this license usage to a CSV file. As you see here, it opens it up into an editor that we can view here. We can further do some searches if we want to. As you see there, it will filter that list. And then we can select this button up here that will copy it to the clipboard, and then we can paste that into a text file and import that into Excel or some other means of processing that CSV information as well. So we provide you with a number of nice features right there in the Enterprise Manager to help you find out exactly what's going on with your license usage all across your enterprise. And the BLS is not the only shiny new object that we're bringing to the table. So we do also have some wonderful improvements and enhancements in the Enterprise Manager. So we're going to be talking about some of those now. So one of those things is database replication and some of the improvements that we've made there. So I'm going to be showing you some improvements in the user interface there. And in the database management system session, make sure you go and listen to that one. We're going to be looking at how it supports the use of encrypted tables now as well, without needing to put the encryption string in the replication job. So that's a nice little enhancement. So make sure you catch that session as well. Also in that session, we're going to be looking at database schema export. Again, I just wanted to highlight that here because that is a new feature in the Enterprise Manager. But again, that's going to be covered in the DBMS session. But we are going to be looking at some various UI improvements here momentarily, and we're going to be talking about some SAML authentication for the browser EM, which is really cool. And we're also going to be looking at simultaneous support for multiple authentication types. And we're going to be talking about management of and use of authentication tokens rather than just a username and password. And then finally, we're going to be looking at context-sensitive help that we've added to the Enterprise Manager. All right, so let's talk about some database replication improvements. So one of those improvements is in the area of the user experience. We tried to make the user experience the wizard for creating replication jobs, in particular database replication jobs, a little more user-friendly, a little more intuitive, a little more in line with database terminology and thinking. So we'll be looking at that here momentarily. This allows you to easily select the table that you want to include. Something else, again, this will be covered more in the DBMS part, but it supports replicating encrypted tables. And one of the cool things with this is that it actually automatically acquires the appropriate encryption string from the database configuration when setting up the replication job now. So you don't have to enter that manually into the replication job, which is how you had to do it prior to version 21 of BBJ. And we've also added a nice little replication job summary on the creation wizard so you can see a summary of what's about to occur when it's creating your replication job. All right, so let's take a look at some of the screens that are now updated and improved in the Enterprise Manager when you're creating a replication job. So this is specifically related to creating database replication jobs. As you see here, this screen may not look a whole lot different. You select your database and it comes up with your target database name. And but what you may notice is that it's given you a little bit better name for the target database. So prior to this, it just would add _replicated, which would mean that if you tried to do it twice, you might run into some name conflicts and that kind of thing. So now we just come up with a unique name identifier. Of course, you can change that to anything you want, but we give you a little bit better default. So that's a small little thing, but nice nonetheless. Now, this is another screen here that is really helpful. Now, when you're replicating a database, it has a number of user properties added in. The add-on database here is a good example of that. As you can see here, there are a number of additional globals that are defined for that database configuration. So we have dictionary and data, but we also have PRB data plus CR data and so forth. In prior versions, those properties were not copied over to the target database, or at least you were not able to make changes to those properties. They were copied as is. But if you needed to change the path or the value to be more appropriate for that target machine, you weren't able to do that. Now you're able to change any of those global properties prior to creating that database replication job. So that can really help save time in having to go then later to that target and manually reconfigure some things. So as you see here, each one of those properties can have a source value set and a target value set. Now you also see, instead of just selecting the files that you want to include or the directories that you want to include, you can choose them by table, because that is what you think about when you're dealing with databases. You're not thinking in terms of files, you're thinking in terms of tables. And so now you have the ability to select those tables that you're interested in adding to the replication job or excluding from the replication job. And then finally, we have the summary page. So once you've built your replication job, then you can see a list of all the files that are included, the directories that are included, and any other settings that are about to be created for that replication job. Keep in mind, though, that even when you are thinking in terms of tables and so forth on a database replication job, you can still add in any additional data files that you would like. It's just that we've made that process a little cleaner as you're going through the wizard. So in addition to the improvements on the replication job wizard, we've also added some improvements to the database tables page. And some of these things are things like a key up at the top to tell you what those little icons meant in the status column. So now you can see that the green check mark means that the table has been analyzed. That's good, because table analysis is important for the optimization of tables, and not having that indication there means that maybe you want to get that table analyzed to make sure that your queries are performing as best as possible. We also have the info indicator that means that there's something that you might want to be aware of about that specific table, a warning, critical errors, We also have added a full text index indicator so that at a glance from the tables page, you can see all the tables that currently have full text indexes available on them. Prior to this, you had to actually open up the table editor to see if it had a full text index. We've also added an indication to let you know that a table is encrypted. So you can quickly see which tables have full text indexes, which tables are encrypted, and so forth. Something else that's interesting to note is that we've also added multiple status indicators into that column. So if there is more than one thing that you need to be aware of, we go ahead and add those in there as well. So you can see now, not just that the table was analyzed, but also that it was analyzed, it has a full text index, and maybe it's also encrypted. So that little indication there will be very helpful as well. Another thing that we've added that should be really helpful is that we've included the data file name and the global path indicators as well as the table name. So now you don't need to open up the table in order to see what the data file name is. You can quickly see that at a glance from this page. And now I'd like to show you a feature that's going to be appearing in some future versions of the BBJ Enterprise Manager, and that is context-sensitive help. As you can see here in this short demonstration, when you move the mouse over a particular label that has help available, it turns to a question mark cursor, and that indicates that some help is available. When you click on that, then it pops up a short description describing that particular property with then a read more link that will open it to the specific page in the basis documentation to give you all of the full details on that particular property. All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about some security enhancements. So prior to version 21, BBJ supported one of the following authentication mechanisms: BBJ authentication, LDAP or Active Directory, and native Windows. And you could choose one or the other. So you couldn't have multiple forms, and those were your available options. Now in BBJ 21, we also support single sign-on SAML authentication for the browser-based Enterprise Manager. That doesn't extend over into application authentication. That's something that Stefan will be talking about here shortly. But just keep in mind that the SAML authentication that I'll be talking about here is specifically for Enterprise Manager authentication when using the browser-based Enterprise Manager. But you also have the ability to simultaneously use multiple authentication types. The reason that this is helpful is that it's very nice to be able to have that backup authentication mechanism in place, just in case something happens with LDAP or SAML and you need to log in and reconfigure it. This way you don't have to go manually changing configuration files. So I mentioned using SAML for single sign-on authentication of the browser-based Enterprise Manager. And I also mentioned that Stefan is going to be sharing some about using a single sign-on plugin in BBJ. But what is single sign-on? Well, single sign-on is an authentication scheme that allows a user to log in with a single ID and password to any of several related yet independent software systems. And it doesn't even need to be a username and password. It can be some other way of logging in, a retina scanner, thumbprint scanner, whatever it is. So let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits of single sign-on. One of the things is that it can mitigate risk when accessing multiple sites. This can be really beneficial when it comes to managing large enterprises. Users' passwords or credentials are only stored in a single location. You've probably experienced some of this before where you've logged in at another site using your Google account or your Facebook account. You didn't have to give that website your user credentials. You were able to just log in with that other identifying mechanism. And so that's one of the great benefits with single sign-on. It helps to reduce time entering passwords for the same identity, so you don't have to log into multiple sites. And it's also easier administration of user accounts because you have one central location to manage those accounts. All right, so now that we've briefly been introduced to single sign-on, let's talk about SAML in particular and how it incorporates with the browser-based Enterprise Manager. So SAML just stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. What it is it's a browser-based single sign-on service. And the way that it works is that the user navigates to a URL in their browser. And in this case, it would be the browser-based Enterprise Manager URL. And then what that does is when it's configured to use SAML for authentication, it will redirect them to your enterprise's identity provider. The identity provider is the place where the user actually authenticates. according to that identity provider's policy. And again, that could be a username and password. It could be a challenge question, a fingerprint scan, a retina scan, whatever it is that you've decided you want to use for authentication. That would be done at the identity provider. Then the identity provider redirects them back to the enterprise manager URL. The enterprise manager, in this case, is what's called the service provider. And if you're familiar with SAML, then these terms make sense. If not, you can go read up on that. But BBJ Enterprise Manager is the service provider. It's passed a appropriate, what's called an assertion. And this assertion identifies who that user is. Now, because we've established a trust relationship between BBjServices and the enterprise's identity provider, that's through configuration done in the Enterprise Manager, we've established this trust relationship. Then the Enterprise Manager decides when it gets a valid assertion back from the identity provider that it's going to accept that. And it's going to say, if the identity provider said that it's John, I'm going to accept that and say, yep, they are John. So that's basically how SAML works. So let's take a look at a demo here. I think this will help make sense of this much better. Okay, so let's take a look at a little demonstration of how SAML works in providing authentication for the Enterprise Manager. So as you see here, we have the Enterprise Manager login screen, and it looks a little bit different because we don't have the typical username and password boxes available there. And that's because we've configured this to use SAML for authentication, which means it's going to go out to another site in order to get those credentials. So as you see here, we can click sign in. And what that does is that actually redirects us to our identity provider. And the identity provider in this case is samltest.id. This is a free site that you can use to test SAML. And in fact, the BBJ Enterprise Manager is configured already with all the necessary settings to immediately use samltest.id for SAML authentication if you'd like to play around with it a little bit. So as you see here, it takes us to this login screen. And now this could be an identity provider, could be a fingerprint scanner, it could be a special card, whatever it is. BBJ doesn't care because the identity provider is going to provide the authentication necessary. So we're going to type in a username here. We're going to use Rick, and our password here is psych. We're going to click these two boxes here just so that we don't remember those credentials right now, and we'll click login. And as you see, the identity provider validated those credentials and gave us some information here. Now, in this case, it gave us a little summary here, and we're still at the SAML test ID site. And you can see the user, who it is, this Rick Sanchez. You can see something here that's also interesting for the Enterprise Manager, and that is role. So you'll notice something with role here in just a moment, how we configure that inside the Enterprise Manager. So let's go ahead and complete our login process. So now we finish the process of logging in at our identity provider. And as you see now, it automatically redirects us back to the Enterprise Manager in the browser. And so now we are logged in. And just to confirm that, we'll double click here on our server, and you can see that Rick is our user, and that's the user that we are logged in as. Okay, so let's take a look now at the security settings. So on this page, you'll notice that there are multiple authentication mechanisms available. So we have BBJ authentication, we have LDAP and Active Directory, and then we also have SAML available. Now we can put a check mark into each one of the authentication mechanisms that we want to have enabled. In this case, I am going to leave BBJ authentication enabled just in case I have to sign in and reconfigure SAML or something like that. That may be a good idea in your case. You may want to go ahead and leave that enabled so that you have multiple ways of getting into the Enterprise Manager if necessary. But in this case, we're going to just take a look at the SAML settings. So under SAML, when we have that selected, you can see here that we have all of our SAML settings available. Now, I definitely will not be going into the details of each of these because, as you can see, it could be quite complicated. However, if you're accustomed to configuring SAML, each one of these fields will make sense to you, so don't be scared off by that. And the last thing that I would like to point out here is the groups page. So the groups page gives us a list of the groups that are available within the Enterprise Manager, and we can assign various permissions to those groups. In this case, you can see that we have one group, and it's named Manager at samltest.id, and it has all the permissions assigned to it. Now, if you recall back to our, when we were signing in at the samltest.id site, the user Rick Sanchez had the role of manager at samltest.id. That role gets passed back to BBJ. And so BBJ knows that it's going to associate that user with this particular group that we've created over here and those sets of permissions. And so as you can see there, now we can assign those permissions to any user that's going to be authenticated at that identity provider. The beauty of this is that we can pass this configuration along to any number of our BBJ services. So we may have maybe a dozen or 100 or even 1,000 BBJ installations available that we would like the users that are authenticated by our identity provider to be able to access. And so by using this mechanism here, we can manage all of those installations in one location using that identity provider. And that's really the beauty of using something like SAML for authentication within the Enterprise Manager. All right, so in addition to SAML authentication support in the Enterprise Manager, we've also extended BBJ with some additional security measures. So not only do you still have the ability to specify a username and a password to identify and authenticate a user, but now you can use an authentication token to identify that user instead of a username and password. And that is a really important capability because it allows you now to store an authentication token either in memory or in a configuration file rather than that username and password combination, which can feel somewhat uncomfortable when you have to leave that password stored somewhere. So now you can use an authentication token instead, and these authentication tokens don't contain the password information at all. They identify a user, but they don't contain enough information to authenticate a user outside of the use of this token. We'll look at this here shortly and go into more detail on that. But these tokens are stored in a JSON Web Token format, JWT, and that is an industry standard method for representing claims securely between two different parties. Tokens are valid only on the BBJ services that issued them. And that's, of course, an important quality of these tokens, because you wouldn't want to be able to create a token on one BBJ services that identifies you as admin and then use that token somewhere else without going through proper channels. Now, we do give you the capability of sharing what we call the shared secret key, which is the way that these tokens are generated and identified and validated. You can share that between multiple BBJ services installations if you choose. And the application for that would be the case where you wanted to be able to identify that same user across multiple installations utilizing the same token. So just keep that in mind. We'll look at that shortly here in the demonstration. The tokens contain visible information, but nothing that could really be used to validate a user elsewhere. And that's an important distinction as well. Now, when you use these tokens, you can use them to access the Admin API or the DBMS via JDBC or ODBC connections. The Admin API provides some methods for acquiring tokens, which is very helpful, where you would provide a username and password, and that would then spit you back an authentication token that you would use in lieu of that username and password whenever you needed to establish another Admin API connection or a JDBC or ODBC connection. Optionally, when you create these tokens, you can provide an expiration date and time. So that's another really cool feature of this, is that you can set a token so that it's only valid for a given period of time. And then after that expiration time, that token will no longer be accepted by BBJ. You can also optionally provide additional payload, and this is more for the JSON Web Token format. If you have applications where you want to parse that token and extract additional information or payload from that token, you can do that as well. And then you can also use the Admin API to renew a valid token. That token does have to be unexpired, so you have to renew it before it expires, but that's also another nice feature of the Admin API. Now, when it comes to authentication token management, this is an important thing that we've added to the Enterprise Manager. So you'll find this under the Security Authentication Tokens page, which will be new if you are just upgrading to a later version of BBJ. The Enterprise Manager provides a user interface for managing these tokens in a nice and convenient way. Now, the tokens listed will display who, the username, the expiration time, And it also gives you the ability to invalidate a token. So not only can you specify an expiration date and time, but you can also go in and explicitly invalidate a token and say this token is no longer accepted by this BBjServices installation. You can also use the interface to create new tokens rather than needing to go through the Admin API directly. Now, why doesn't the Enterprise Manager show the token itself? Well, valid tokens are the equivalent to holding the username and password. And so again, we don't want to be able to have somebody log in and just peruse through and find, oh, there's a token for this particular user, and then be able to impersonate that user or something of that nature. So that's why we don't show that in the Enterprise Manager. So once you generate the token, you do need to remember it or record it somewhere, because there's no way to go back again and find that token value. All right, and so we're back over in the Enterprise Manager looking at the Active Authentication Tokens page. You can get to this page by going to Security and Authentication Tokens here in the Enterprise Manager Navigator. Now, you'll notice on the page it shows a list of the currently active and valid authentication tokens. Once a token expires or is invalidated, it won't appear in the list anymore. Now, you can see here that each token has a user that it identifies, when it was issued, and then also the expiration date and time as well. So you can see that right there in front of you. Now, notice one here is highlighted in red, and that just simply identifies that as the token that identifies me as the current logged in user of the Enterprise Manager. Now, you may be saying, well, I don't want to use tokens. I just want to use usernames and passwords. Don't worry about that. All of that still works exactly the same as it did before. Internally, once you log in with a username and a password, we do generate a token, and that token is then used to identify you throughout BBjServices internally. But from your perspective as an end user or as an administrator, there's no difference in behavior. So don't worry about that. Now, if we want to invalidate a token, let's say this is a guest user, we don't want that token valid anymore. We just select it, click the minus button, and it goes away, and that user can't log in anymore with that token. Now, we can also create tokens here because, as I mentioned, you can do that through the Admin API, but you may not want to do that programmatically. You may just want a simple way to create one really quickly, and you can do that here now. So what we do is we type in the username and the password, because we do need to validate that we need to prove to BBjServices that we truly are that user and that giving us a token is a valid operation. So we put in that username and password. We can specify an expiration time in the number of minutes. We'll be looking at the default setting for this in just a moment. And by the way, that defaults to 480 minutes or 8 hours. And so, but we're going to shorten that here. And then you can specify some optional payload just with some name value pairs that will go along with that token. I'm going to go ahead and do that here just because we're going to be looking at a website that extracts the information from this token here momentarily, just so you can see what that looks like. But typically, you're probably not going to specify a payload. Now, once you've provided the information, you just click the Generate Token button, and there is your new token. So we're going to copy that token now here because, as you'll notice in the Enterprise Manager, it doesn't show that token. And so we need to make sure that we take that token and put it somewhere in order to use it, because there's no way to get it back again later. All right, so now we've looked at generating a token. So let's look at how we might use it. Now, over here on the Enterprise Manager, this creates a JDBC connection, and it passes in a username and a password. And so we can execute that, and you'll notice here we get our results back. Now, if you want to specify a token instead of a username and password, then you would provide that as a connection URL property or in the properties object that you're passing into the get connection when using the JDBC API, or you would specify this in the ODBC driver, that kind of thing. But you can use a token, as I said, instead of that username and password by using the token connection property equal. We paste in our token value, and now we can execute that query, and we see that it returned results. Now, I can go back in and I can invalidate that token. So that token is no longer valid. And I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to try and use that token again. And when I do, I get an error message that says authentication token is not valid. Now, notice that did not invalidate the user by any means. I can just remove that token and provide the username and password as I would normally do, and it still works perfectly fine. Now let's go take a look at that settings page. So the settings page for the security settings shows us a couple of new fields here. One is the JWT shared secret. And what that is the secret key that allows BBjServices to uniquely identify tokens. So it's used in the generation of tokens, and it's also used in validating a token when it's passed in. And so that key is very important. Now, each BBjServices installation will create a unique one for itself. So you don't need to create that yourself. But if you want to change that, all you need to do is click this refresh button and it will generate a new one for you. Now, if you want to share this key with another BBjServices installation, all you need to do is copy and paste that key from here, paste it into that field on another BBjServices installation. And now those two BBjServices installations can share tokens between each other. So a token created on one will correctly and legally identify that user on the other BBjServices as well. The authorization token default expiration can be set right here. So as you can see, it defaults to 480 minutes, but you can set that to any value that you that you find appropriate. Okay, and so I also thought I might show you this cool little website that allows you to parse JWT tokens so that you can look at what's inside that token. It can be a really useful tool to identify a token, but also just in learning how these tokens work. So you go to jwt.io and you'll find this page here, and it's basically a JWT token debugger. Now what we'll do is paste in our token, and I have this token pasted in right here. And as you can see, it parses that information. So it knows the name, the payload that I added in there, those name value pairs that I added, who issued it, the expiration date and time, and the username. Now you may be saying, oh my gosh, it has all this information and it was able to just pull that apart. Doesn't that make this insecure? Not at all, because that token is generated in a way that will be validated by BBjServices. So a token that was generated with this exact same information by different BBjServices would look completely different than what you see here. So BBjServices is going to use that secret key to validate this token.
Thank you. Now let's have a look how you can improve the user experience and security of your own BBJ application. Let's start with using a third-party service such as Google or Microsoft to log into your BBJ app. Instead of having to remember the password to your app, the user simply uses the login to the service she's using most often every day, like Google, Microsoft, or Apple. Using the SAML authentication shown previously is also available to your BBJ application. Using third-party services for login to your application has several advantages. The user has one single place to store his username and password, which makes it very convenient to log in. If your user has enabled multi-factor with that service, your application will benefit from this increased security as well. Basis has added a plugin to facilitate adding single sign-on and third-party authentication providers to your app. The new AuthKit plugin comes with prepared login widgets and also offers a library to add time-based multi-factor authentication. The third-party login services currently work in GUI and the new dynamic web client. Time-based multi-factor can also be added to your existing GUI and even character-based app. Let's first have a look at using an external account to log in. We have prepared a sample application that offers by default to log in with BBJ credentials. You can, for instance, use the known admin and admin123 login with it, which is the default for a fresh BBJ installation. Now let's see what happens when you click the Login with Google button. My browser has remembered the accounts that had been used recently on this computer. I can select which one I like, or alternatively, I could add a fresh one. I enter my password and I'm logged in the app. The demo app fetches the username and the avatar picture from Google and displays it in the top right corner. Some additional information like the user's email address is available for additional login logic in your own code. The BBJ app is now logged in with this account. Until I log out again, it will remember the login, and a push to the Google login button puts me through with no further action. This behavior is similar with the other providers. In this sample app, I use my Microsoft account to log me in. As I was still logged in when I took this video snippet, I am directly redirected and you see my name and the avatar picture that I have configured with my Microsoft account. You can add single sign-on to your application with the AuthKit plugin. In order to do so, your app and the public URL of it needs to be registered with each authentication provider individually. You will receive an account token that you need to add to your own code. If you need assistance with using the AuthKit plugin to add third-party authentication providers, you can request the assistance of our professional services team. The AuthKit plugin adds another feature that is independent from third-party providers: time-based tokens for use with common authenticator apps that you can install on your phone or tablet. To initialize the authentication, you scan a QR code. The app will show a time-based token that the user will enter during the login process. Let's look how it works in detail. Our sample has a page where I can configure time-based multi-factor tokens. It shows me a QR code that is generated based on a random secret. I use my smartphone, open the Authenticator app, and scan that key. The app shows me a first token, which I enter to my BBJ app to validate the connection. Now BBJ and the Authenticator app on my phone are in sync, and next time I try to log in, the demo app will ask me for a token from the app before it lets me in. Like all BBJ plugins, the AuthKit plugin comes with a comprehensive demo that will help you understand the process and the necessary steps to add multi-factor authentication to your own app. Time-based passwords can be added to all types of BBJ applications: character-based, GUI, BUI, and the dynamic web client. Our small demo app also adds SMS-based multi-factor authentication. For that purpose, I'm using the Previs One SMS Gateway product. Previs One is a product offered by Basis that lets you send and receive SMS messages not only with your BBJ app. SMS is a universal format that users can receive and read without needing to install a specific app. Let's activate SMS authentication in our demo app. I enter my phone number and hit the button to receive a code. With that code, I can activate SMS authentication to my app. Every time I log in now, BBJ sends me an SMS with a code that I have to enter. That way, the security of the application greatly improved. You can add both time-based tokens and SMS multi-factor authentication to your application and offer the user to choose. Both can be added today with little effort to any BBJ app. Now it's time for your questions.